Good afternoon. I'm Melissa Samuels, Director of Alumni Programs for the Albany Alumni Association. Welcome. I'm glad you could join us today for our presentation on how to reduce the risk of burnout. Before we get started, I wanted to review just a couple of housekeeping items. First, wanted to let you know that we will be recording today's session, and I will make that available to you next week. Also, we will be doing a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions for our speaker, please put those in the Q&A and not in the chat. They may get lost in the chat, but feel free to use the chat just to comment or ask questions of other participants. So let's get started. Let me introduce our speaker today. Joelle Monaco is president of Joelle Monaco Consulting, where she empowers her clients to strengthen the three pillars of their businesses: people, processes, and performance. She has more than 13 years of experience in organizational development. She's a lecturer for UAlbany's Professional Adult and Continuing Knowledge Department and has been a trainer for the National Council for Mental Wellbeing for over 6 years. So Joelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I love seeing all those alumni posts and shares. I have a whole bunch of people from the social work world. So I'm so happy to be and have you join me today. I'm going to go ahead. Share. Right now we've got the screens all set up. Let me just move my chat bar and we'll go ahead and get started. So how is everyone? How are you doing this morning or afternoon, right? What time is it? All of those times flush together. And I guess this is probably a great topic for a way to start our conversation. Where are we in the world today? Again, my name is Joelle. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm really excited to get to talk about, organizational operations and how do we really put ourselves first? Let's be honest, it's been a long few years, and I'm sure we've all experienced change. And a lot of that may have felt like it was outside of our control. More likely than not, a lot of us experienced change that we had zero or little control over. And we recognize how that may have impacted us, right? Despite our best efforts, we can't prevent change. We can't prevent things from happening, but what we can do is build more tools in our toolbox so that we're better equipped when those situations happen. And that's a lot of what our conversation will be about today. Some of this stuff is probably going to be familiar to you, but like I say, it's always great to have a reminder and get a different view of how you can implement it in the workplace. I think a lot of times we tell people to do these things. We look at the way we can do this in our personal life, but how can we actually build this into our day-to-day workplace so that we can be the best we can be and make a better community? So thank you for the introduction. Really just a highlight, my consulting and the work I do with my clients is always people first. Individuals are an organization's most valuable asset, and I build that into all of the programming I do. And I'm really excited to be able to integrate, organizational operations, leadership, and mental health and well-being into today's conversation. So I think you'll see bits and pieces of that all throughout, as you see in a lot of the other things I offer, both in the community and through SUNY. But before we get started, I want to take a minute, get comfortable in your seats, resituate however it is that makes you feel best. And I want you to let go of everything that's happened today, right? Let go of everything that's already happened and take a moment and let go of all the things that need to happen. Right? The list of things you have to do after this that are probably running through your head. Then I want you to let go of the tension you're holding on to. If you're like me, drop your shoulders. Maybe you're rolling your neck. Move in whatever way you need to right now. Maybe you've been looking at the computer all day, so you need to look up at the sky and stretch from side to side. And if you're comfortable, close your eyes and let's take a deep breath in. Hold it. And let it out. And let's do one more. Take a deep breath in. Hold it. And let it out. And I do that so that we stop, we recognize where we are, and we can be present, right? There's a lot of distractions. I've got a few phones laying here, emails in the background. But one thing we have to recognize is as we grow and evolve and, really focus on our well-being and what we bring into the workplace, being present is a big piece. So great way to get started. I hope maybe for some of you that helped to reset what's been going on in the day and kind of put you in the right frame of mind for where we are going. So let's go ahead and set the stage for our conversation. I'm going to ask you throughout the conversation to reflect on past, current, or future situations. By all means, we do have an open chat. I encourage you to get involved in the conversation. This presentation is participatory. It is 100% your training. And if you're tuning in and listening in, you can always reach out to me with questions after. But what your level of comfortability is adding in the chat, you can also just send it to the host and panelists so we see it and not the whole room sees it, whatever you're most comfortable with. So my first question, how many of you have heard of this thing that they all talk about called work-life balance? Right? How many of you have heard of work-life balance? Probably, I see a whole bunch of hands are getting raised. Thank you. I love reactions on Zoom. And then I'll ask you, how many of you have found balance in anything in your day-to-day lives? Right? How many of you actually have found balance? And a lot of times I say this is a funny topic because balance I find as like an unrealistic expectation, right? A lot of times we set this for ourselves or for others, and it's like this unicorn of like this work-life balance. And what is really balanced? And then I'll ask, how many of you consider yourself a caregiver, right? Maybe inside or outside of the workplace, you're sharing, you're taking care of others, family, friends, maybe colleagues, kids, right? And chances are we're much more empathetic and forgiving towards others than we are ourselves. And when we talk about this balance, right, it's tough. We need boundaries. You're on it, Stan. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. I love it. You're kind of a couple steps ahead of us. But when we talk about work-life balance, I often challenge us to reverse that conversation, right? And a phrase I like to use is life-work integration. Because at the end of the day, my life becomes before my work. And it's not in a bad way. It's not to say I don't care about my work, but I live to work. And if we look at it that way and we integrate it, we have a little bit more of that ebb and flow. And we can give ourselves grace on the days that we may be showing up at a level 15 versus a level 2. Right? And recognize that there are going to be ebbs and flows, and that's okay. And sometimes we have to embrace it and recognize it, and also look at what can we do to set ourselves up for the best possible situation. So let's go ahead and jump into our first question. And this is going to be a poll. I'm going to go ahead and launch it for you. So you should see it popping up on your screen. What percentage of people say they have experienced employee burnout at their current job? And I'm going to give you a little bit of a heads up. So for those early answers, don't worry. This is pre-2020 data. I am using a lot of pre-2022 data for the sheer fact that data is all over the board from 2020 and 2021, and it'll take a little bit until we start to see more typical responses. So again, what is the percentage of people that say that they've experienced employee burnout at their current job? We have 43%, 56, 82, or 77. Go ahead and get your final answer in, and if for any reason the poll's not working, you can also drop it in the chat. I'll see your responses too. All right, it looks like we've had a good amount of people respond. I'm going to go ahead, end the poll, and close it for myself. So again, this data is pre-2020, and what it found was that suspense, right? 77% of individuals cited that they have experienced burnout at least on one occurrence, right? And if you think about this, we look pre-2020, we know 2020 and 2021, there were much higher levels of stress. So these numbers were much further exacerbated. I'm sure if you didn't experience, certain levels of stress, strain, or burnout, you knew somebody that did, especially possibly in the workplace. And in addition to that 77%, 87% of professionals surveyed in the same survey said that they still had passion for their current job, but 64% said that they were frequently stressed. And it's really important to highlight that because that dispels the myth that passionate people are immune to burnout. They're actually at an increased risk. We find that highly engaged and passionate individuals are actually at a greater risk for burnout because they're so involved and they're so connected, and their identity is really connected to that work that they're doing. And I saw some of the fields that you were typing in, and I will say there's definitely some individuals that are in higher risk factor, right, in places of employment or sectors. And considering that we spend at least a third of our adult life in the workplace, this is a really important topic for us to understand, recognize, and integrate into our workplaces and into our day-to-day life. When we look at other data, we also see 1/3 of Americans report experiencing chronic stress, and less than half of those thirds said that their employer provides sufficient resources to help employees manage their stress. So that's a big recognition, right? If you are a leader, and that doesn't mean you have to be in a leadership role or have a leadership title, we can all be leaders. If you're a leader in your workplace, how can you learn today, take some tools and resources and bring that back to the workplace? So maybe those that are experiencing that chronic stress and don't know where to go can look to you as a resource and the things you're modeling. So let's unpack stress and burnout a little bit more. So let's start with the basics. How many of you have heard of at least one of these terms? I'm going to say majority of you have. I see hands shooting up. I see reactions, right? You've heard at least one of these. And it's really important to recognize that these three pieces are actually a line of progression. So they're actually connected. So what that means is that you're not just burnt out, right? Like there is a line of progression from negative stress, negative strain that leads to burnout. And really, when you think about burnout, it's a buildup, right? It's a buildup of unrecognized or unmanaged stressors. And I say unrecognized because a lot of times we find ourselves experiencing burnout and we don't recognize how we got there, right? A lot of times it's hindsight is 50-50, right? When we're looking back, we can say, oh, this, and this. But the whole piece of recognizing this is really building the awareness, right? Half of the piece of taking better care of ourselves is just being aware, recognizing what we need, what we have. And when we look a little bit deeper, right, stress involves a stimulus and a response. And they're in relation to one or another. And there's a natural relationship amongst that stimulus and that response. And stress doesn't always have to be negative, right? It could be good stress. It could be getting a promotion, right? But when you get a promotion, now you sit with different people at lunch. The people that you could maybe debrief with or have sidebar conversations and, get things off your chest, you can't do that anymore, right? So it's a positive stress, but it may bring on negative strain, right? And that occurs when our environmental demands or constraints, and we perceive them as exceeding our ability and our capacity to navigate certain situations. And there are three main types of strain. That's environmental, organizational, and individual, right? So when we think about strain, environmental is really hard for us to have a control on, right? Organizational is whatever, maybe our workplace, maybe our community. And then individual is the bubble within. And that's the one that we have the most control over because clearly we have the most control over ourselves. I saw a few hands being raised. If you have a question, I'm going to ask you to drop it into the chat. So that way for the recording version, we have the best possible version for everybody to tune in. So if you do have a question, the chat is open. Feel free to drop your questions in there. So again, stress, strain. When we don't navigate those or we don't have the right tools or resources, it can lead to burnout. Melissa, I see your hands raised. Maybe not, maybe by accident. Okay, perfect. We can look at burnout and it has a variety of definitions. And burnout is not something that's new, right? This has been around for a very long time. Studies date back, to the early 1900s. So burnout, I'll give you one of my most identifiable, right? Like the easiest definition is to fail, to wear out, to become exhausted, and a loss of creativity. And I think that's really important because burnout is not a rite of passage, especially not in the workplace. It is a reality check. In the workplace, if we are experiencing burnout, we withdraw. We have absenteeism. We have intent to leave our job. And a lot of people have left their jobs because of burnout. And it goes without saying, like, how does this impact your personal life? It all carries over. When we talk about that life-work integration, it's not like we leave that bag at the door, right? We can't. It's almost virtually impossible to even say that and recognize that people used to use that statement quite a bit. But the nice part and the optimistic part we can look at, even though this line of progression can happen and all of us are at risk, the term burnout suggests that it's a permanent condition, but it's important to recognize that it is reversible. 51% of our health status is based on our lifestyle, and only 20% is based on our environment, which means we have the most significant ability to impact our health status based on the lifestyle choices we make and the lifestyle choices we implement into our day-to-day life. So we can positively influence our well-being by changing maybe lifestyles or recognizing what resources we have available. So last question about really burnout, or I'm going to throw it to you, drop them in the chat. What are some risk factors that come to your mind when you think about individuals possibly experiencing or having an episode of burnout? What are some of those risk factors that would put people at a higher risk? Go ahead and drop it in the chat. Give it a second. I know it takes a couple minutes to type in here. And these could be professionally or personally, right? Because I think that's important to point out. And here we are back to boundaries. We are a big boundary group, which is okay. So lack of boundaries, right? That's an easy one. Saying yes when you really mean no. And I actually heard a great statement this week. No is a full sentence. You don't have to give an additional reason, right? Being a caretaker. And I think being a caretaker has such a wide umbrella. Could be for family member, could be for kids, could be for friends, family, or even your team, right? We are caregivers and we're givers. And we always find ourselves being the last on that list. Lack of appreciation for efforts and production. That is awesome. We're going to come back to that in just a little bit. Personal life, just being hectic, overlapping needs, being pulled in multiple directions. Hostile work environment. Yes. And those could be toxic work cultures, which could be based on the industry. They could be systemic. They could be based on a leader, right? They could be based on a team. There's so many different impacts. Some that just don't have the luxury of rest, right? We hear about this self-care thing all the time, but it doesn't necessarily, how do we build that into our lifestyle, right? Overscheduling and not scheduling priorities properly. Yeah. So all of these things, 100% are risk factors. And I just saw unrealistic expectations, which is one of my favorite. There are tons of them, right? And some of these, again, are within our control and some are not. And some of the biggest ones we've seen pop up, and I'll just highlight a few, working with businesses and organizations and individuals, I've seen a lot of the obligations, the erratic changes, workloads, and then the monotony of the work. Traditional roles that may have taken place in the office that are now virtual, we really have to look at them. Are they monotonous tasks? Are people doing rote things that aren't really expanding their ability to be creative? Because if so, we're putting people at risk of burning out, or we might ourselves be at risk of burning out. And also, lack of clarity and communication. That's almost always one of the top barriers that I see in organizations for organizational cohesiveness, people experience, and growth. And then, of course, last one, lack of personal accomplishment. So sometimes projects are just so big that we have this big goal, but we don't ever break it down. So it feels like we're just in that hamster wheel all the time. And you can see some of these, I'm saying them in relation to work, but these all compare to our day-to-day life too, right? I'm sure this list could go on, but what I will say is if there's certain risk factors that you're identifying, one of the things we say to be proactive is to recognize what's a protective factor, right? What are things that can create counteract some of these uncontrollable risk factors that you can depend on, right? Because it's inevitable, stress is everywhere. It's in our everyday life. If you have to commute anywhere, it's stressful. And there are some things we can't control, but there are things we can control. So that's where we're going to switch gears, kind of set the stage. We know a little bit about it, but how do we take care of ourselves and how do we implement that into the workplace? So, saying something and doing it are two different things. I'm sure a lot of you on here are really good at telling other people how to take care of themselves. But when it comes short, a lot of times you're thinking, wow, maybe I should have taken this advice. If I were listening to myself right now, right? Like if I was truly listening to myself, what would I say? And a lot of us have to be intentional about taking our time for ourselves, both personally and in the workplace. And recognize that, if we start to have these workplace stressors or life stressors and we don't take care of ourselves, we're going to notice we're going to have increased frustration levels, right? This might roll over into our life, or if it's in our life, day-to-day life, it might roll over into our workplace. We'll have challenges maybe with interpersonal relationships, and that could impact family, friend, colleagues, clients, and the list goes on, right? And it's also harder to focus on problem solving. When stress is there and it's present, it actually has an effect on our brain and our ability to be creative, to solve problems, and to think on our toes. So that's why it's really important, not just saying like, oh yeah, I'll take care of it, but we see residual impacts on ourselves and what we're able to do. So we need to show up as our best self, right? And to be who we want to be and what we want to bring to the community, to our workplace, to our family and friends, we really need to be aware of that. And in saying that, I often say the one thing, there's a lot of things you can't control, but the biggest spoke on this wheel is individually. We can take personal accountability for ourselves and how we move forward, because how we think impacts how we feel, which impacts how we act, right? A lot of times we miss this, and we often think about how the impact, but we don't think about how our mindset may influence that. So first tool, resource, right? Starting with each day with a self-check, being aware of where we are and if we need to be grounded. If you notice, we did that at the beginning of today's training, right? Didn't take a lot of time, but it really allows you to recognize where you are and what you need and what support you need. And that could be from a body scan, really recognizing from head to toe, am I holding tension anywhere? Do I feel like there's a little extra pain somewhere that I need to take account for, right? Then the other piece is maybe just taking a few deep breaths in between activities. Maybe that means having a 5-minute buffer between these lovely Zoom calls or these Zoom meetings that we have every time. Just doing what you need to do to disconnect, right? Just disconnect, maybe opening up the window, listening to the sounds outside, taking a peek around, but really recognizing what's going on. And studies have shown individuals who take the time to accept those thoughts and those feelings, even if they're negative, right, have certain effects, and they're able to effectively solve those problems better than avoiding them. And it's important to recognize that we can ignore those feelings of discomfort, and yeah, it'll provide a quick fix, but what we find is that it can be untreated, unrecognized, unsupported, and it can lead to significant challenges. And we know if we're not taking good care of ourselves and our well-being, it can lead to mental health problems like depression or anxiety, which are diagnosed mental health disorders, which have severe impacts. And that's why really recognizing that early recognition and treatment is so important. So another one, tool and resource, and I saw this come up, the optimism, right? Do you expect more good things will happen to you? Right? Do you expect more good things than bad? A lot of times, right? We think, oh, we're risk adverse. So we think of the negative thing of, oh, it won't work. But I will say optimism is not a passive state. Optimists are typically expecting good things to happen, and they are active in those thoughts. It's not just hoping, right? It's not just hope. It's really looking at it and challenging yourself to be optimistic about situations. And we know individuals who are optimistic or challenge themselves to be optimistic actually have a higher rate of well-being. And they find that impact, right? One step to increasing optimism is eliminating pessimistic language, right? And a lot of this exists in the workplace. Language and words like bad, canceled, cautionary, right? Conflict, difficult, fail, impossible. So if we can change those words, right, it can change how we think, it changes how we act, right? It's that whole line. And additionally, if you find maybe the optimism is a little bit challenging for you, we can also look to gratitude. Someone in the chat had said, just not feeling appreciated. And I'm going to go ahead and launch our second poll for you. And this one's really interesting. And I think it's true, and probably many of you have felt this. So what percentage of individuals have been thanked at work in the last month? We have 34%, 56, 22, and 78. All right. What percentage of individuals have been thanked at work in the last month? All right, I'm going to end it. If you didn't jump, go for it. I see a few people hesitating. No right or wrong answer, right? Your personal experience is going to be different. All right, let me close that, and I'm going to close it down. So we have the majority of you saying 34%, which is right. 1/3, 34% of those surveyed in a recent study said that they have been thanked at work within the last month. Only 34%. Right? And let me remind you, expressing gratitude doesn't just fall on leadership. Consider, when's the last time you genuinely thanked a colleague, right? Like studies, giving them that thanks of like maybe going above and beyond, maybe just helping you out, maybe just asking how you were doing. Thank you so much for just checking on me. I really appreciate it. Right. And studies show that, people who find things to be grateful for have better health than those who don't. And I, have challenged myself recently, and a lot of times I will just express gratitude. If I can do it once a day, right? Like if that's the goal, and optimism is a little bit challenging, take a step back, recognize something you're grateful for, and express that gratitude to those around you. And we find that gratitude is infectious, right? Once we start doing it and it becomes part of our day-to-day life, it becomes really natural. It's not something we have to do or have to think about. Right? It's just a piece. And gratitude also shifts our biology and lowers blood pressure and releases dopamine, which we'll talk about in just a little bit again, because it's really important. How do we change our body based on the things we're doing? How do we release dopamine, which is a feel-good, right, emotion and a feel-good chemical that our brain produces? Great. So now we have those two. What are some more? So we have routines and rituals. How many of you have routines or rituals outside of the workplace? You go to maybe a spiritual gathering, maybe a workout class, Sunday dinner, date night, meeting with friends, game night. I don't know. I see a whole bunch of hands getting raised, right? You have those routines and rituals. But I will ask, how many of you have routines and rituals in the workplace? How many of you hold that life-work balance between those routines and rituals, between the workplace and your personal life, right? And a lot of times what we find is we have this one thing for our personal life, and that's a routine or ritual, but sometimes we might forego it because we don't have great, we all mentioned them before, boundaries, right? So we'll say, Monday I go to my workout class, but somebody needs me or I have to stay late at work. So I will just skip it. Right? I'm sure everyone on this call has done this. But what happens if we start to skip and skip and skip? Then we fall out of that routine. It makes it much more difficult to get back into it. But then we see that was our self-care. That was our thing. That was the thing that filled our tank back up. And if we're not doing that, how are we taking care of ourselves? And the same in the workplace. If we're not taking that time for ourselves and creating routines or rituals in the workplace, so that might look like, hey, when you log on or when you get to the office, maybe you take 5 minutes to really look at what's your schedule. Take 5 minutes to look at your schedule. And do you feel prepared? Is there anything you still need? So that way, once your day starts, you feel like you've got at least a little bit of a handle on it, right? Some days it's Tasmanian devil. We just have to get through the day. But if we have that routine or ritual, maybe it's you have to have your coffee or your tea or your glass of water when you sit down at your desk or show up at your job site, right? And then you collect, what do I need for the day? What do I need to be successful? And where maybe do I need to have some ebbs and flows? And where do I have some pickup snacks, right? Like, where do those things fit into my day? And when we have routines and rituals, it really creates accountability, right? It supports positive habits. It increases our focus, our productivity, but it also makes it a little bit easier when we have to be adaptable, right? If we have routines and rituals that we stay true to, when we have to reprioritize or change things, it's not as dramatic because it's not something that we just do, we wait all month to do this one thing and then we can't do it, right? And this actually links right in, and I'm going to roll over from routines and rituals to time blocking, because I think these two really go hand in hand. And any of you have that run-on list, right? Like my list, I just keep adding things to the bottom. I actually have a planning list that only allows me to have 5 priorities. Because realistically, how much can you get done in a day? We know multitasking is inefficient, and it actually has a negative impact on us because we can't pull from one area to the other. So when we're time blocking, right, we're really being intentional. And when I say time blocking, I mean making a time block for lunch. I know so many people sit at their desks, right? And then when that stress, strain, and burnout builds up, just eating is a great self-care tool, right? We know there's beneficial effects of eating and taking breaks. Even a 10-minute break has scientific benefits on problem-solving skills and being able to navigate difficult situations. So when people say to me, I don't have time for a break, I will say, let's time block it. Let's say, where are you going to just step away from whatever it is that you're doing? And when are you going to time block in your regular life, right? If you're a caregiver, do you have maybe that 20 minutes in the morning of quiet where you can read your favorite book? You can listen to a podcast or listen to music or just dance around in the kitchen, whatever floats your boat, right? So time blocking and making that time a priority is going to be really essential. And it's going to allow you to recharge and reinvigorate that creativity, but it's also going to prevent you from getting stuck in that wheel of the ongoing list, right? And putting out fires. We know there's a lot of different things going on, but if we start just putting out fires, we're really not taking care of ourselves in a proactive way. And I always like to end this one by saying breaks equal better people. They do. Breaks in our personal life, breaks in our professional life, they just equal better people. So this is an image. If you struggle, right, with staying and maintaining this balance or these boundaries, really prioritizing when things come to you, worth professionally or personally, looking at them and saying, okay, how do I prioritize myself? Where does whatever XYZ fall in this grid? Is it a priority? Like it really needs to get done? Is it something that maybe doesn't need to be done? It's a need, but it can get done at a later time. Maybe it's something I can ask someone for support with, right? Maybe a friend, a family member, a colleague, or a team member, they can help me out with this. Or is it something that I've just added to the list because it's my hopes and dreams, but it doesn't really need to get done right now? I will say that doesn't count for like your personal stuff, right? Like you can't put all the things that focus on your well-being and taking care of you in the later box. We want to put it in the priority box too. And this will force you to kind of take a step back and say, okay, this came into my picture today. It was not on my schedule. Where does it fall? And how am I going to navigate it? And why does this matter when we're talking about burnout? Because those controllable things, right? How are we building ourselves for success? And if we keep getting all these things out of left field, right? And we keep putting them in the top left corner of priority, we're going to have unrealistic expectations. We're going to lack boundaries, which is going to increase our stress, potentially lead to negative strain and burnout, right? It happens, and it can happen fairly easily without us even recognizing it. So that's why building these tools into the workplace and making them a priority is essential. And this is something you can do at the beginning of each week, or if your routine or ritual is to sit down, right? If this is a new one you're going to start every day, sitting down for 5 minutes to kind of map out the day, you can use this and say, okay, here's the 5 things on my to-do list. Where do they fall in prioritization? Now, where are my personal, right, my life priorities, and how do they fit in? And how can I integrate them? Maybe it is that you have that workout class, or you've been meaning to catch up with a friend. Can you do that at lunch? Because chances are, if you schedule something like that on lunch, you're actually going to take lunch, right? So it's a lot about being strategic. And I'm sure many of your roles in the workplace require you to be strategic, but you've never thought about how do you build a strategy around your well-being in the workplace. And I think this is really important because you see the data as much as I see it. I've been in the mental health field for quite a while, and I've seen us come a long way, right? Stigma's reducing, people are reaching out, resources are available, businesses are listening, and we're evolving. So let's make it a priority and make it something that we don't think about it as a reaction, but we're proactive, right? We have to create space for our minds to rest so that we can problem solve and show up. So the last section we'll really talk about is creating, and I always put this word in there, sustaining change. I don't want you to just make a change this week for this month, for this year. Like, you want this to be change that you can build on. That obviously will evolve because we know change evolves. So I'm going to throw a question out to you. On average, how long does it take for someone to change their habits and get into new routines? Drop it in the chat. What's your guess? On average, how long does it take for someone to change habits or to get into a new routine? Go ahead and drop it into the chat. 100 days. All right. See, 21 days. Oops, sorry. I didn't mean to throw the questions up there. Let me get those down. Apologize for that. 30 days, about 3 weeks. So there's this whole chicken egg, with everything data, there's always different answers. So on average, we see it taking anywhere from 66 to 120 days for someone to change habits and to get into new routines. So when you think about all these tools and resources that I'm sure you've shared with a friend, maybe a client, maybe a colleague, maybe a peer, a mentor, you have to maintain these for nearly 120 days, which means, guess what? Some days you won't do it. Some days you will fall short of whatever that routine or ritual was, but it doesn't mean we give up, right? We have to restart the next day and we have to prioritize it. And maybe where we prioritized it didn't work. So how do we take a look at, well, how might I change this? How can I make this? And change is not easy, right? Doesn't matter if it's personally or professionally. Change is difficult. It's uncomfortable. And to sustain it takes work. It's not a set it and forget it. So this is one of my favorite slides on, Maslow's hierarchy of need. I'm sure many of you heard about it. We learned about it in like middle school and high school. But how are we really bringing this into the workplace? So for many of our workplaces, we are focusing and individually on this self-actualization, right? Being our best selves, showing up, solving problems, being creative, right? And doing all these amazing things at the top. But most of us, the majority of people, are not taking lunch breaks, are not getting adequate sleep, may not even have shelter or the things needed to show up. A lot of people are lacking their basic psychological needs, or we're not being attentive to those psychological needs. So we're building our pyramid upside down, right? We're focusing on everything at the top, which again makes us teeter. If we don't have a solid foundation, it's almost and virtually impossible to achieve that self-actualization. And I say this because as individuals, we can recognize what are benefits. How does our workplace support each one of these levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? If you are a leader in any capacity in the workplace, how can you bring this information back to your workplace and make it a better place that focuses on a person-first approach, right? We know in the capital region, and I'll be honest, in majority of the areas, people are living below the standard average mean of income, right? A lot of people don't have an income that allows them to meet their basic needs. So how can workplaces support them? Then we have safety needs. Is the workplace safe? Is it not? Is our living environment? Is our neighborhood? Some of those things we may be able to control. Some of those things we may not be able to. But how are we being attentive to it, recognizing it, and building in tools and resources to support us? And of course, you see that love and belonging in the middle, which a lot of people are like, well, if we're talking about the workplace, I mean, come on. How many of you have ever been in a workplace, been in a situation, volunteer, maybe mentorship, where you didn't feel like you belonged, right? And a lot of times people just kind of linger over on the side, right? We're not connected. We don't have that identity. And that sense of connection can go a long way, both for ourselves, right? So how do we build that connection and how do we create time? And in the workplace, we've become very transactional. Hey, how are you doing? Not that I care what your response is, but I have to ask this question for formality. So be intentional. When you ask somebody how they're doing, ask it with the intent to listen. And I heard somebody before put in the chat, active listening, right? Really listening to them and create the time and space to set that time aside and say, yeah, I hear you. Have you heard of XYZ? Maybe I can help you with this. Keeping in mind our boundaries, because I see that as being a common thread amongst this group and others. And then, of course, we're fulfilling these basic needs, there is a certain level of esteem, right? There's a certain level of esteem that we have ourselves, which leads to that self-actualization. And I see someone in the chat is written, there's a stigma around personal needs that come, over business needs. And I hear this all the time when I work with clients, and I challenge organizations to really look at this and look at the benefits and look at what they're providing, utilization, employee needs. We can have really interesting conversations. And a lot of times I compare this to, all of you hear of employee engagement, right? Well, there's something opposite called people experience. Employee engagement is the business or the employer giving the employees what they think they want, need, and desire. Whereas people experience is actually asking the people, what do you want, need, and desire to show up and be your best self? And it's a different viewpoint, right? Evolution, we evolve. And I don't think many businesses do this intentionally. I think a lot of times it always falls on we've always done it this way, but that doesn't mean that's the way it always has to be, right? So how do we challenge the stigma? How do we bring facts and data to the workplace to say, how do we actually create change? And then there's going to be a second graph. This one's on your handout and it provides you a little bit more detail, but this is really looking at holistic well-being. And this is SAMHSA's 8 dimensions of wellness. So some of you may be familiar with this, but I'll challenge you to sit down and really look at what is one dimension of health and well-being that comes really naturally. You don't even have to think about this. This is just something that you feel confident in doing. And then what's one that you didn't even know exists? Because when we think about health and well-being, typically in society, we think about physical. That's it. We don't think about the other 7 dimensions, which have as much, influence on who we are and how we show up. 2 I'll highlight really quickly are spiritual. A lot of times that is associated with religion. It's not. It's really, what is your purpose? What is the impact you're making on your community, those around you, your workplace, right? What is that impact? A lot of times we can achieve spiritual well-being through philanthropic things like volunteering, right? That's a really easy way that sometimes people don't connect that. And we find if we're taking those opportunities to volunteer or give back, it builds up our well-being. It reduces our stress levels, right? As long as we have the time in our schedules to accommodate it, right? All things are relative. And then occupational is not being good at your job. It's necessarily feeling rewarded and challenged in your job, right? A lot of us have been in those stagnant positions where burnout's high because we're still doing the same monotonous work. So is our occupation challenging us? Can we bring outside strengths to our workplace? I'm sure if we looked at anyone on this call, your job or your work, right? Whether you're independent, you work for an organization, we looked at your role or what you're doing, chances are there's a lot of other skills and talent that you have that you could bring in that would inspire you and would elevate the level of services or the jobs you're doing. So consider that. And I'll say after today's call, take a minute. Maybe it's in your 5 minutes tomorrow morning when you start your day, but look at this and say, what is really natural? What's an opportunity for me to work on? And you notice I said 1 and 1. I didn't say do the whole list. We have to be realistic, right? And we know change takes time. So be realistic with the one you're working on. Be intentional, block out time, make those time blocks, and see if you can get to that 120 days where it becomes natural. And then it becomes part of your routine, right? Everyone will have access to the handout. It's going to be emailed to you. It was emailed to you. And we'll potentially be able to drop it in the chat before we hop off today's call. But great question. So last but certainly not least, I will say insert the eye rolls here. I'm going to talk about happiness. And there are 4 primary chemicals that affect the brain and influence our happiness. It is dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And I will say happiness is not fulfillment, right? But when we combine happiness with some of the things we've been talking about, it can further reduce stress levels and the impacts of us becoming overwhelmed. And there's a wealth of data behind happiness, and it's been found that happiness can actually increase sales by 37%, productivity by 31%, and accuracy on tasks by 19%. So there is this piece of, if we focus on happiness, and it doesn't mean that we're discrediting all of the other things going on in our life, because we recognize, and things in the world, right? We recognize things are challenging, things are happening, but how do we show up and focus on this? And how do we see the overall improvement of our life, both in our day-to-day life and in the workplace? So a few quick ways: increase dopamine. And this is our reward chemical. We can do this by just taking part in self-care, by eating food. So remember, I talked about lunch breaks. You can actually spike your dopamine levels by actually taking a lunch break. So put it on your calendar, right? And this one we can also do by celebrating wins. And that's why I said it's really important to break down those big goals to smaller goals so that we feel that sense of accomplishment. And we release that dopamine that keeps us going along. Oxytocin, giving a compliment. Doesn't matter if you're in the store, reflect on a time when someone gave you a compliment on anything, right? Hey, I really like your shoes. Your hair looks great today. This was a great presentation. You really helped me out. Like, that makes you feel good. And it's infectious. We find that people, when they give compliments and they receive compliments, it continues. It's like that chain reaction. So, and by giving a compliment, you can increase your oxytocin levels. Then we have serotonin. This can be meditating. And when I say meditating, that's not sitting quietly. Yes, it is a component, but meditating for some people is cleaning, coloring, right? Doing the dishes, just something where you can take a step back and you can focus and you can kind of shut down all the chatter in our brain and let go of all the things around us. Another great way to increase serotonin is by getting outside, which, if you are an alumni and you are still in New York, right? This could be a challenging thing, especially in the winter when it's cold. But just getting out and getting that fresh air and exposure to the sunlight can increase those levels of serotonin. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have endorphins, which laughter is the best medicine, right? Telling a joke, even those terrible dad jokes, will fill this void, but happiness is something that we know we can influence and can impact us. And as we round out, when we're thinking about creating change based on our approach today, it's really about looking at what is something you can do. How can you lead by example, right? Taking your PTO and actually doing it, prioritizing yourself and sharing how you felt by actually taking your PTO, getting to know one another, turning off. We were actually having this conversation this morning. When I log off of work, I almost throw my phone in a lake. I know that's not reasonable for everybody, but maybe turning off, saying no, and recognizing no is a full sentence. Being realistic with yourself, and also having grace, recognizing the grace you give to others, you can give to yourself, and you should give to yourself. In saying that, if you found any of these things beneficial, resourceful, or you want to learn more, I will encourage you. I do a lecture for SUNY's Professional Adult and Continuing Knowledge program, and it's a micro-credential program. I'm going to drop the link into the chat. Our next live online course, titled Taking a Person-First Approach to Your Organizational Operations, will kick off on February 9th and run through March 2nd, and that will happen every Thursday from 6:30 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we'll include topics like burnout. We'll go a little bit deeper, but we'll also talk about human capital, organizational belonging, workforce development, and really committing to a culture of change and elevation. QR code, you can scan it. It'll take you to the link. I dropped the link in the chat, but if you're interested in learning more about that, by all means, reach out. I'm going to throw it to Q&A. I saw some going in, but feel free, send over any questions, and you have my contact information. Melissa, do we want to open it up? Was there anything you saw come through? Awesome.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. I know folks were handing out. Folks were doing some questions during the session, but we did have a couple that were put into the Q&A. So we can start with the first. Has working from home increased the prevalence of burnout because of the lack of boundaries between home and work?
Yes, we've seen that more. And that's why I said I'm not using data from 2020 and 2021, because we're seeing all of those changes and the lack of control, but also individuals now, where you work is where you live for some people, and that we see that change, and that change is probably not going anywhere, right? This is a change that has had both benefits and challenges. For some of people, they've gotten rid of their commute so they can actually show up for their life, but they have to really focus on what do those boundaries look like. And I also say, I challenge workplaces. How do they support those boundaries? Are we sending emails at 3 a.m.? Because if we're doing that, people feel a need to respond, where there's a great thing called schedule sends that you can just send the email to go at like 10 o'clock in the morning. But yes, we've seen an increase. And that's something we've been working with workplaces, is really on how do we respect people's boundaries and how do we encourage people to put those boundaries and communicate them. Let other people know, what are your boundaries?
Well, I think that speaks a little bit to another question. One of our attendees today said, my boss emails or texts me late into the night, which really stresses me out. What can I do about this? How would you recommend he or she handles that?
I get this question all the time, and I do a version of this just for leaders. And what we talk about is this, because it is a power dynamic, right? If your boss emails you, it puts a certain level of stress on you where you feel like you need to respond to it. I think being honest and open. I have certain alerts that come through on my phone that say basically, I'm not on. If it's a work phone, they will get a response that this person's on do not disturb, right? And it could just be a conversation. If you're not comfortable having that conversation, don't respond. And I know sometimes that could be challenging, and I am giving generic responses. I know everything's not going to be unique, but if you have a relationship, sit down with them and talk to them about how, when you get those messages, it makes you feel. And I know it sounds a little bit fluffy, but we have to be honest. And if we don't, a lot of times leaders don't do it intentionally. They just don't recognize it, right? Or they don't recognize it's on the top of their mind. They're really passionate. They're thinking, oh, this is a great idea. They send it to you and it causes you stress. So I think communication is number one. Number two is, if you have to do boundaries, it's set them and don't answer. And if they ask you, hey, I sent you a text, you didn't respond. Yeah, I've been really focusing on myself after work. So I have to create those boundaries, and that's it.
Okay, great. Another person's asking about a coworker. She says, I have a coworker who started showing up late frequently, doesn't seem to have any drive left, seems to be taking a lot of breaks. Do you think she could be suffering from burnout? And if so, what should I do? What can I do to help?
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of signs and symptoms there that something's going on, right? The person's disengaged, or actively disengaged, we will say. And I think a lot of times that starts with a conversation of, and if you're a leader, I always start with, I really care and I'm here for you. I've noticed you're showing up late and it doesn't appear like you are as enthusiastic about projects. Can you tell me more about what's going on, or how can I support you? Right. And it could also be a developing mental health challenge where we might have to refer someone to the EAP. But I think the more we recognize those signs and symptoms and have open and honest conversations, it creates the space to be proactive as opposed to reactive.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, looks like we have one more question. Oh,
yeah.
Just now we've got two more. All right. How do you manage burnout while experiencing grief personally?
Well, burnout and grief are two different things. Right. And I think, depending upon what level of grief we're talking about, it might also involve a professional, right? Seeking out a professional to help navigate those situations and those feelings and those experiences. Could they be happening simultaneously? Yeah, because a lot of us are really passionate about our work and we experience grief and whatever, or loss in whatever way that is, right? It could be of a person, a relationship, an identity, something tangible. And it's not until after that happens that we recognize, wow, we're feeling really overwhelmed, or we wish we would have done X, Y, Z. So I would say it's going to be individualized. I would say taking care of yourself. But if you're recognizing that those feelings or emotions aren't going away, or they've been there for a while, reach out to your general physician and have a conversation.
Okay, here's another question. How do you manage burnout when you're self-employed? Oh, wait, just put that question in the chat and it just disappeared. Okay, here it is. How do you manage burnout when you're self-employed or you own your own business? I feel like I'm always on.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I'm with you. And I would say it takes time, right? That 66 to 120 days is a real thing. I think you have to create boundaries and be realistic with the goals you're setting. right? When you're self-employed, what is the goal for the year? How does that break down to the quarter, to the month? And building in that time for yourself. And I know I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, and I hear from a lot of entrepreneurs about like, well, how do I justify turning off? Well, if you don't turn off, your business will not be sustainable, right? Without you, there is no business. And sometimes you have to have that sense of reality of, it's different when you're doing a startup. I get it, right? You're grinding, but you're probably not showing up as the best self. So what does that self-care look like? What do those boundaries look like? Even if it's like Sundays, I'm not turning on my email, I'm not doing anything, whatever that day of the week is. Or if you're saying like nights after 6 p.m., I'm done, right? And like you create the space and hold that boundary. And you might have to tell somebody so that they can hold you accountable, because we're much better when we have somebody else holding us accountable. It's not easy. I don't think it ever gets easy, but it's something that you have to prioritize.
Okay, great. All right, one more question.
Mhm.
As a supervisor, how do you suggest handling an employee who takes half the month for sick and vacation time and then complains about not enough support and help to get her job done?
Yeah, this is a great question. I feel like
That's
this
a
is a
loaded
loaded
question.
question. Yes. Well, and I think there's balance, right? And there's also, that's a lot of, organizational structure, right? Like what is the reasonable amount of time that it takes to do the job and do the job efficiently? And this might be more of a developmental conversation or, a review question, because I do think there is a balance. And then it's also looking at operationally. Well, and we have these tiered approaches with PTO, right? Where sometimes people get up really high and then they're not balancing their workload, or they've been there for a really long time, so they have a lot of PTO. And I think that's more of a unique question of asking them, well, how many days this week, reflect back on the time that they've been out and say, okay, how many days a week do you think it takes to complete the job and do it well, right? And unpack what that looks like. Because at the end of the day, if they have a certain amount of PTO, we can't say not to take it. And I encourage people to take all of their PTO, because so much PTO goes unused every single year. So I feel like that would be a unique conversation. If you want to have it offline, I'm more than happy to do that.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our session time. So, Joelle, thank you so much. This was really informative. Obviously people were asking questions and comments, and I think we're fully engaged. And I hope everyone took away some good ideas that they can put into practice in their personal lives. So.